In this video, we're going to talk about the market for monopolistic competition in more detail. Specifically, we'll examine how a monopolistically competitive firm will set its price and output in both the short run and the long run, and we'll talk about how profits may change as firms enter or leave the market. Let's just review a little bit about the basics of the monopolistically competitive market model. It's similar to perfect competition in that there's many buyers and sellers. There's no barriers to either entry or exit. It's similar to monopoly, though, in that each firm is the only producer of a particular product, but there's close substitutes, which makes it a bit different. Because of product differentiation, each firm faces a downward sloping demand curve. With this downward sloping demand curve, we know that marginal revenue will be less than the price, and the marginal revenue curve lies below the demand curve. And this is going to be an important feature of monopolistically competitive markets. Notice that this demand curve and marginal revenue curve look very much like what we observed in a monopoly situation. Where things are different, though, is what happens as firms enter the market. Suppose that the initial demand curve is a demand curve D, and suppose that a typical firm is receiving positive economic profits. What will happen in that case is, because there are no barriers to entry, new firms will enter the market, and the demand for each firm's output will shift to the left. Not only will it shift to the left, but at any given quantity, it's going to be more elastic than it was before. The reason is, if there are more firms in the market, there are more close substitutes, and earlier we talked about the determinants of elasticity, and we know that when there are more close substitutes available, demand is going to be more elastic. Suppose, for example, Ethiopian food becomes more popular in New York City. Initially, there may not be very many Ethiopian restaurants, but if it becomes relatively more profitable, new firms are going to enter the market, and as they enter the market, consumers are going to have more close substitutes. So if any one of those Ethiopian restaurants raises their price, they're going to end up losing more customers because customers now have more very close substitutes to the food that's being produced at that restaurant. On the other hand, if firms leave the market, demand is going to increase for each restaurant. Basically, what's happening here is that as new firms enter the market, the customers are going to be spread out among a larger number of firms, and therefore each firm will end up with fewer customers when consumers have more choices available to them. On the other hand, if firms leave the market, the reverse happens. As firms start to leave, customers now have fewer choices, and the demand curve facing any one of the firms is going to rise, and also become somewhat less elastic as consumers have fewer choices available. An interesting result that we can note is that as the number of firms in the market tends towards infinity, the demand curve will tend towards a perfectly elastic demand curve. So in a sense, the perfectly competitive market model is a limiting case of monopolistic competition that occurs only as the number of firms tend towards infinity. Let's consider profit maximization in a monopolistically competitive market. As in other market structures, we can note that whenever marginal revenue is above marginal cost, firms can increase their profits by producing more, so they produce more. Whenever marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, firms can increase their profits by producing less, so they will produce less. This is also true for loss minimization. The maximum level of profit or the minimum level of losses for any firm that continues an operation will be where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. This diagram represents a typical firm in a state of short-run equilibrium in a monopolistically competitive market. Currently in this market, the optimum level of output for the firm occurs at the level of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which in this case is at Q star, where the marginal revenue and marginal cost curves intersect. To determine the price, you go to the demand curve, and you find that the price that the monopolistically competitive firms would charge at this level of output is P star. Since P star is above average total cost, firms are making positive profits, and that shaded rectangle is the dollar value of the economic profits received, because the height of the rectangle is profit per unit, the base is the number of units. When you multiply those, you get total economic profits. But if a typical firm in this market is making positive profits, it means the owners are doing better in this market than they could elsewhere. Because there are no barriers to entry, other firms are going to enter the market. And what we just noted is that as new firms enter the market, each firm is going to end up producing less output, receiving a lower price, and receiving lower profits. But that will continue until those profits are eliminated. And when profits are eliminated, we end up with a long-run equilibrium as depicted in the diagram here. The optimal output for the firm occurs where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and the price in this case will just be equal to average total cost, because if the price was anywhere above that, more firms would enter, driving demand down until we got to this equilibrium here. So in a long-run equilibrium, a typical firm in a monopolistically competitive market will receive zero economic profits. In this way, the firm resembles perfect competition, in that, in the long run, economic profits are zero. However, it's different than a perfectly competitive market because you notice this does not occur at the minimum point on the average cost curve. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. Let's think about what would happen, though, if in the short run, a typical firm is receiving economic losses. In this case, the optimal level of output again occurs where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and the price is given by the demand curve, again labeled P star. But in this example, average total costs are above the price, so the firm is losing money. But because the price in the short run is above average variable cost, the firm finds it better to stay in business. It can minimize its losses by producing an output level of Q star in the short run. In the long run, though, some of these firm owners will realize they're losing more money than they could if they shifted to a different industry. Some of them will start shifting to other industries. And as they shift to other industries, the remaining firms will now divide up those customers among them, and the demand curve facing each firm will start to shift outward again as firms leave. And it will also become slightly less elastic. That process will continue until we end up with the losses disappearing, and that will occur when enough firms leave the market so that a typical firm will once again be receiving zero economic profit. This long-run equilibrium is referred to as a tangency equilibrium because it occurs at the point at which the demand curve is just tangent to the average total cost curve. If the demand curve was above the average total cost curve, there would be firms entering and profits would occur, driving demand down. If the demand curve is below the average total cost curve, firms are losing money. Some of them will leave, driving demand and the price back up until profits or losses are eliminated in this long-run equilibrium. Let's compare the outcome for a typical firm in both monopolistically competitive and perfectly competitive markets. The demand curve D sub MC and the marginal revenue curve MR sub MC would be the demand curves facing a typical monopolistically competitive firm. If the market, however, is perfectly competitive, we know it faces a perfectly elastic demand curve that will, in a long-run equilibrium, be equal to the minimum average total cost. So under a perfectly competitive market, the price would be P sub PC. We've established that in a long-run equilibrium for a monopolistically competitive firm, the quantity occurs where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and the price is given by P sub MC. So the competitive outcomes are a quantity of Q sub PC and a price of P sub PC, and monopolistically competitive outcomes would be Q sub MC and P sub MC. There's a couple things we can note about this. One is that a monopolistically competitive firm charges a higher price and produces less output. And there's some efficiency costs associated with this. One is because a monopolistically competitive firm produces at the quantity Q sub MC, it's not at the lowest point on neither a short run nor a long run average cost curve. So what that means is there's some excess capacity. If the firm produced more output, its cost per unit would be lower. So it's capable of producing more output at a lower cost per unit. And that's essentially a loss of productive efficiency. So we see that monopolistically competitive firms experience inefficient production. So the cost of producing output is higher in a monopolistically competitive industry. The other point, though, is that competitive firms produce where price equals marginal cost, but monopolistically competitive firms produce at a price above marginal cost. And that results, as we've talked about in earlier videos, in deadweight loss and allocative inefficiency. So we lose both productive efficiency and allocative efficiency when we have a monopolistically competitive market. In other words, if all products were exactly the same from all firms, we'd be able to produce output at a lower cost per unit, and you'd move towards a socially optimum level of output where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. However, many people would prefer to not live in a world where every restaurant offers exactly the same food, or where all clothing is exactly alike. We value product variety, and because of that, these two losses are somewhat inevitable. And most economists would argue that the gains from having product variety are sufficiently large to overcome the cost to society of both excess capacity and deadweight loss. We should also note that monopolistically competitive firms can, in the short run, receive profits by engaging in product differentiation and advertising, and we see a lot of that in both local and national markets. However, if a firm successfully differentiates its product, other firms will copy it. Similarly, if a firm engages in successful advertising, other firms will copy that strategy. And as they do that, the profits from the differentiation or the successful product differentiation will disappear in the long run. So in the long run, the profits associated with product differentiation or with advertising will tend to disappear.